So what are the best looking models for your Warhammer 40k faction? Let's talk through every single one in turn, and the single miniature or model kit that people rate the most. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking nice looking Games Workshop models for every single army in the game. Recently I made the counterpart video to this, talking through the miniatures for each faction that people rated the lowest, which tends to be a fair mix between really quite old kits and more recent blunders. For this one though, I thought we'd take a look at the positive end of the spectrum, and for that one I did a similar sort of channel poll. Around about 1,000 or so people voted. I put down a whole bunch of suggestions for each Warhammer 40k army and invited suggestions for more, adding any ones that had multiple suggestions to the poll for rating. A big thank you to anyone who took the time to have their say in that, but basically it should be at least a somewhat scientific look as to which miniatures the average hobbyist likes the most out of their faction, perhaps often but not always being the big centrepiece ones, and there's certainly ones that hit the mark more than most. Obviously all this is a bit subjective. Some people really enjoy some of the older classic sculpts that others might rate lower, and some dislike the popular picks. For each faction though, let's talk through a bunch of the models that people ranked highly, and then focus on the single kits that people like the most. Starting out, we'll go through the Imperium first, starting with the Space Marines, and then go on to Chaos and Xenos. For the force of the Adeptus Astartes, they have a vast amount of model kits, though I feel like really quite a lot of them just fall in this sort of alright category as opposed to being enormously standout. I guess maybe being seen as sort of the generic Space Marines versus the chapter specific ones maybe doesn't help them too much. For some of the ones that were rated highest though, the Phobos Librarian got an approval vote of 68%, really quite a fun shadowy miniature that one. The new Terminators from Leviathan got 70%, they certainly went down notably well in 10th edition. Bigger and chunkier miniatures, they're not really deviating too far from their classic design. Rebute Gilliman, the Primarch himself, got almost 70. Spoiler alert, that still puts him at the single lowest out of the 5 Primarchs though. And then the runner-up was the Redemptor Dreadnought apparently, being voted in at 72%. I'm not really too surprised that that one ranked fairly high as well. I think it was a fairly nice and well-received update on the classic boxy Dread design. Winning it for the Space Marines though were the Blade Guard veterans. Looks like they managed to take the prize here, and it wasn't particularly close, 80% versus 72, and they're perhaps particularly well received for a squad as well. It looks like the vast majority of things that got votes quite this high tended to be big centerpiece things, so enormous characters or big monsters. I feel like people just tend to rate squads a little bit lower, maybe due to being slightly less focal centerpieces. I'm maybe not too surprised to see the Blade Guard up here though. They were well received miniatures from 9th edition coming out in the Indomitus box to start with, initially having their easy build version and then having the multi-part kit. Really quite a flexible kit that you can assemble in all manner of different ways with their sword and shield loadouts or a bunch of variant poses like these ones demonstrated here. I think the reason they were quite so enjoyed is that they came after the era of Primaris where the vast majority of them were really quite straightforward, simple miniatures, going for a clean and uncluttered aesthetic, and then the Blade Guard added in a whole bunch of more standard Space Knight weirdness, shields with reliquaries on them, tabards and purity sails and things. I think people found them a pretty good balance between the two ideals. Next up, for the Hammer of the Emperor, we've got the Astra Militarum. They've got really quite a big range with a whole bunch of stuff in it. The majority of things that rate pretty highly are fairly recent miniatures. We've got the Cadian Kazakin that were the reinvention of their classic plastic kit. They were really well received for their Kill Team one, again kind of notably highly rated for a squad. And then the other three are all things from the recent Krieg release. Lord Marshal Dreyer on his rather fun pose on his Krieg steeds. The Artillery Team, which I think was just a very nicely done model with its sandbags and little diorama with its crew. And then the Deathcore Command Squad, a bunch of iconic guard stuff there, marshalled over by a Lord Commissar. They were the runners-up with a rating of 75% by you guys. I think it's pretty cool to see a classic get the top spot though. The Baneblade was voted just 1% higher than those on 76. Seems that guard players couldn't resist the classic silhouette and the great big story of the big exciting centerpiece tank. It feels like it's just had a lot of excitement for the guard since the days of Dawn of War. It feels pretty unusual on this list for a few reasons really. There aren't many vehicles here at all. It's by far the oldest miniature here, coming out alongside the original version of Apocalypse. That was all the way back in 5th edition, I believe. And there aren't many Titanic class things as well, maybe more sort of big monstrous characters. It's a really cool model though, both on a big overall impression sort of scale and some fun details. I quite like its little reliquary type thing at the back and the Baneblade tank commander. And to be honest, I do find it kind of fun that it's beaten out some of Games Workshop's more recent kits. For the Force of the Machine God, we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus. Really quite a recent, complicated and detailed plastic range. The majority of their miniatures, I think at least fairly well received. Not too much that was rated particularly low. I think it was the Scatros and the Electro Priests. But for things that were towards the top of the pile, there's the chunky retro robots that are the Castellans, the Sicarian Rust Stalkers with their assassin construct blades. The standard Skitarii Rangers, which were ranked a bit higher than the Vanguard. I feel like if there's ever a model that's just iconic to the faction, it's things like the Skitarii Ranger Alpha perhaps, an awesome blend of cyborg soldier and some flowing red robes. The ranked in second place was the Tech Priest Dominus, basically the faction's standard HQ. A twisted and hunch-over tech priest with far too many limbs and added bits on. Again, feeling like it's capturing the vibe of the Mechanicus rather well. Voted in at top, and a good way clearer than the rest of these, is Belisarius Core. He was originally released for the Triumvirate of the Imperium box alongside Celestine in late 7th edition, and the Art Magos certainly has a pretty cool and crazy miniature, basically going for the same vibes as the Tech Priest Dominus, but bigger and better. I'm really pushing Augmented Human to the absolute limit. Sort of feels like he's going for the similar sort of vibes to more classic Admech art there. He feels like a bit of a centerpiece model to the army in the way that nothing else really does, in my opinion. In any case, he won the Admech vote, and by really quite a big margin. Next up, we've got the big stompy robots of the Imperial Knights, and for these guys, people didn't really have huge strong opinions about models in their range. Almost all of them were ranked at least fairly close to each other. The Castellan Knight being voted in at 68%, and then Canis Rex getting the vote for people's favourite flavour of Questoris Knight. I guess having a bit more story to him doesn't hurt, and having Sir Hector the Pilot as an extra miniature to get out adds a bit more fun factor as well. I think the Imperial Knights range was just pretty well received, basically mini titans that you can field in regular games of 40k. A lot of people had some excitement for those. It seems for this one, the one that people enjoyed the most though was the Imperial Knights Celerastus Knight Lancer. So that's the Forge World one, though admittedly it's not really meaningfully higher than the Questoris at all, more on the same kind of level. I think the Celerastus Knights look is pretty well enjoyed though, more long-legged and mobile and threatening looking knights perhaps. And if you're going to have some iconic weapons for a knightly faction, then that fits pretty well. I have seen some people choose to swap out the energy shield though. Maybe it has a bit of an unusual feel to it, either trying to do some way of creating a sort of lightning effect in it, or going for something a bit more solid. Before we move on to the rest of the Imperium, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Baron of Dice. They're a high quality dice maker based in the USA that made some fancy dice for the channel, and asked if they could sponsor a few videos. Their main offering is to have a vast array of different faction specific dice that could be relevant to all manner of wargaming things out there. Plenty of things that could be useful enough for Warhammer 40k, though more besides. There are all manner of Imperial ones for your Golden Guardians and Knightly armies, various flavours of Chaos with multiple different designs, and plenty of options for a whole bunch of different chapters. Generally any of their dice that I've seen have been pretty high quality. There's a choice between round edges and squared edged ones, and I was certainly pleased with the merch ones that he made for the channel. Their typical prices are around about £28 or $35 for 25 dice. If you use the code Auspex, then you get 5% off any order, so be sure to use that if you're picking anything up through them. I'll also leave a link to the channel dice down in the video description as well, if you did happen to want something with the channel logo on. But in any case, a massive thank you to them for sponsoring the video. They'll be linked down below if you want to take a look over their stuff. Let's get back to some Imperial armies though, and next up we have the Knights of Titan. When I was polling people on their best miniatures, I must admit I was maybe a little bit surprised at just how low the majority of their range was rated. Obviously there's a big sense that they could do with a range refresh, just given that Games Workshop have scaled up the vast majority of the other Space Marines around there besides them. Though even so, I was maybe still a bit surprised that their next most rival kits for the highest voted miniature were Grandmaster Voldus and their standard Terminator unit, and they were only polling in the sort of mid-40s sort of range. If anything, it does feel a little bit harsh to them. Voldus isn't exactly the oldest miniature in the world, and while he might not be a super exciting centerpiece character, I feel like he holds up well enough. It was maybe no big surprise as to who was voted first though, and that was Castellan Crow. He's basically the only Grey Knight miniature from the more modern Primaris scale age, but still basically being a firstborn marine in terms of styling and aesthetics. As miniatures go, I think he was a pretty well done one as well. A fun sculpt with the burning cursed blade. But it doesn't look like he's going to have any big rivals for the top spot for Grey Knights if all they're going to release this edition is a Dread Knight upgrade sprue. Hopefully it won't be too many years before he's joined with some reinforcements for the rest of his battle brothers. Next up, we've got the Adepta Sororitas, in general a pretty recent and well-received model range. Plenty of rivalry for the top spots here. The second highest voted was the Triumph of St. Catherine. I felt there was going to be a pretty reasonable chance that that one might win. A pretty awesome mad funeral procession with cherubs swooping above, all sorts of sisters bearing relics around some martyred remains. Seems that it was beaten out to the top spot though. Otherwise there were a fairly vast amount of things in the low 70s to high 60s. The Seraphim and the Exorcist were the next two. I feel like the Jump Sisters with their angelic sort of jump packs are really quite cool ones for the faction, and the Exorcist with the mad blend of church organ plus artillery tank is dead fun. There are lots just behind that though. The regular Battle Sisters and the Immolator scored highly, as did Morven Val and a bunch of others. For actually placing top though, it was Saint Celestine herself, the living saint repeatedly restored to life by the Emperor's will when she falls in service. I believe she was basically first of the newer era Battle Sisters, releasing very shortly before Reboot Guilliman in 7th edition as part of the Triumvirate of the Imperium alongside Belisarius' Call. And the miniature is a nice one. It feels pretty good as a centerpiece representation of the faction, borne aloft on her great angelic wings jump pack, bearing flowers and doves and a great big flaming ardent blade with which to purge the enemies of the Emperor. The trailing parchments maybe don't feel too clunky as a way to keep her supported and not have to use a flying base as well. In any case, she was voted very high at a big approval of 83%. Next up, we've got the Golden Guardians of the Emperor, and the Adeptus Custodes again seem to have a whole load of miniatures that were pretty recent, and most of them liked well enough, though maybe not crazy standouts. It looks like really quite a lot of their model range was kind of equally well liked. All the Forge World Dreadnoughts were all on 63%, as was Trajan Valoris, and then for second place it was joints between the Allarus Custodians and the Custodian Wardens, so all manner of flavours of big Custodian infantry and chunky dreadnoughts there. I feel like all their models are nice enough with some pretty cool detail on, and do a good job of representing the faction. I think I might have given Best in Faction to one of the Dreadnoughts if it was me choosing it, to be honest. The one who was voted the highest by you guys, though, was the Blade Champion. For highest voted model, he maybe had one of the lower approval ratings out of this list, though, at only 70%. He was the single character release for the Custodes for 9th edition when they released alongside the Genestealer Cults, and he is quite a fun character with a fairly dynamic pose, fighting in slightly lighter armour than some of the rest of the Custodes, and using a pair of Volt Swords to lay down the enemy's champions. Feels like there's not really too much to criticise about him. He's really quite nicely done, though not exactly quite so much to write home about as some of the other faction's centrepiece champions. I guess the Custodes might have a few more models coming in the not too distant future, if Games Workshop do indeed release a big amount of them for Horus Heresy. Next up, we've got the Imperial Agents, maybe a bit infamous for having the single worst voted miniature in 40k by the last video, and that was Kotias. Plenty of their other models are nicely enough received though. The ones that came runners-up were the Arbites at 68%. People quite enjoyed the reimagining of the Imperial Elite Police. They get bonus points for the Cyber Mastiff in my opinion as well. And then two of the assassins, the Calidus and the Eversaw, were also tied with them. The Calidus with her big hair, polymorphine, and arcane weapons, and the Eversaw having a good sense of motion running along that wall, and every bit's the crazed killer that you'd imagine him to be. The Colexus wasn't too far behind. Taking the top spot for the army though was the Vindicare Assassin. I feel like it's hard to go too far wrong with the cool factor of the Imperial Elite Sniper. His current model does a good job to convey what he's about, though I wonder if he might have picked up a few votes in relation to the Warhammer Plus one that came out when that launched, which was a particularly well received miniature. There's a really nice dire armour with the Vindicare sniping from the ruined statuary with the sort of Sisters of Battle head. Maybe kind of a shame that that wasn't a bit more of a more general ranged item. Finally for the Imperium, let's loop back to talk about the Divergent chapter Space Marines. The Blood Angels with their recent refresh have maybe been more talked about at the chapter that did least well out of the refreshes so far. I feel like that does hold true without that many miniatures being voted high for them. Sanguinary Guard being notably down the rankings, though most of the rest of their characters were at least alright received. They had Astarath and Lamartes here. I feel like for the Lamartes, there's lots of people that really quite like the miniature, but I think he divided opinions more than some. And then only just narrowly beaten into second place was Mephiston, Chief Librarian of the Blood Angels and Conqueror of the Black Rage. I think they did a really good job with his miniature, looking like an all very imperious vampire space marine. Only just ahead of Mephiston was Commander Dante though. He was on 71 versus Mephiston 70, so basically the same. It basically seems that the two characters that the Blood Angels already had before their more recent release wave seem to have won this. Dante came a bit earlier than the rest, being remade in 9th edition along with the Arks of Omen series. Again, neither of those seem to be absolutely rave reviews compared with the rest though, getting more sort of 70% reviews as opposed to 80 or so. Dante's miniature has definitely done nicely enough though, a pretty faithful reimagining of his previous design, Death Mask, Axe and Inferno Pistol, and I get a good sense of movement with him sort of alighting on a rock. Kind of interesting that maybe his armour design isn't a million miles away from the more recent Sanguinary Guard. I guess never having wings in the first place, and being more expected to have that kind of Death Mask maybe did him favours compared with those though. Seemingly doing far better than the Blood Angels on the popular vote were the Space Wolves though, kind of notable that they've got about 5 different kits. They're all rated about as well as the Blood Angels' best one or higher. Here we've got 2 squads with the Wolfguard Terminators and the Wolfguard Head Takers, both really quite fun themed elites in their different ways there. Both the Wolfguard Battle Leader and Jarl Stormcaller were also on 70, Arjat Rockfist was on 72, and then taking second was the Wolf Priest. He was voted all the way up on 79%, really quite a nicely received miniature. A brooding wolf skull peeking out from under that hood and looking all rather imposing as he stalks forward in those flowing robes. For the Space Wolves though, there could only be one winner, and that was Logan Grimnar. He was voted all the way up on 83%, so pretty high within 40k in general. is certainly the newest single entry on this list, only just having come out in 10th edition alongside the Space Wolves refresh, getting the new Terminator update with big chunky armour, and having a pretty big scenic base to go with him, standing on that rocky outcrop, flanked by a couple of wolves, and glowering down at the enemy as he prepares to commit to battle, I presume. Feels like the paint job maybe did him a pretty good service as well here. I feel like they've done the shadows on his face really well there. Overall seems that he's been really quite well liked as a centrepiece model, and certainly seems to have sold in fairly vast numbers, despite Games Workshop charging quite a bit for him. Next up for the Xenos Hunters of the Deathwatch, they had their range release back in 7th edition around about 2016 I think, all their models hailing from then. They don't exactly have a huge amount of models in their range, though the runners-up were the regular Deathwatch veterans, Kill Team Cassius at 55%, and then the Watchmaster at 57%. None of them rated particularly highly for the faction. I feel like, again, that's probably showing a bit of prejudice towards things that hadn't been upscaled yet. Though I feel like the Watchmaster's a pretty cool leader sculpt as he goes, standing resolute with his custodian-style Guardian Spear. Perhaps with one of the miniatures that surprised me the most in terms of the outright winner for them, though, was the Corvus Blackstar. Seems that this one was outvoted compared with the rest to win the prize for the faction, getting a 64% approval rating. I guess I wasn't expecting it to do badly, though being single best miniature was kind of a surprise for me. It is a fairly modern plastic kit, and I think they did really quite well with it, to be fair. Good vibes for the Deathwatch dropship with some Inquisition symbols on the front, being a sort of Spec Ops flyer for the faction. I'm still maybe a bit surprised that this one was voted top here. I think I probably would have picked Kill Team Cassius myself. Just the sheer amount of flavour and interesting little details in those miniatures I'd say would win it for me. Again, I feel like there's a bit of an aversion to Verseborn scale Marines. I guess the Primaris is starting to make them feel scale creeps. In any case, doesn't sound like it's going to be too long before we get some more Deathwatch miniature reveals, so I look forward to talking about them when they turn up. Next up though, and perhaps doing the single best for their model update so far, are the Dark Angels. Games Workshop redid a bunch of the Deathwing half of their range in early 10th edition, and they had a whole bunch of different kits that seem to have been rated some of the very best in Warhammer 40K. Asmodai was fairly well liked, voted at 71%, but then the Deathwing Knights are all the way up on 84%. Big chunky Terminators going down a rather knightly armour style aesthetic, maybe borrowing a few nods to their Horus Heresy takes. It did feel like they got the balance on those really quite right. And then just nosing ahead of them were the Inner Circle Companions, basically the Primaris reincarnation of the Dark Angels robed and hooded veterans as they had in the past, and their curious lore of Redeemed Fallen maybe adding to their story. These two are pretty notable as being the first and second highest rated squads in all of Warhammer 40k it seems. As mentioned, it feels like centrepiece character models get a bit of a leg up on them, just due to being more focal and maybe easier to rate higher centerpieces. As well as they are though, both of them seem to have been just mildly upstaged by their Primarch. Lionel Johnson was basically on the same sort of level as the Inner Circle Companions, just voted 1% higher, though again his miniature was particularly well received, looking imposing and intimidating enough for a Primarch, a good balance between finery and practicality with his armour. I'd say maybe one of Games Workshop's better head sculpts. Their faces can certainly be a bit hit and miss, and then some extra nice details on the base to frame him with a couple of watches in the dark. Overall, a very well received reinterpretation of a key character. If anything for the Dark Angels though, I'm maybe more impressed by their squads in terms of being rated quite this high. Feels like maybe a big achievement for them to stand out this much compared with a big centerpiece Primarch model. Finally for the Space Marines we have the Black Templars. They had a small but fairly complete range refresh in 9th edition, and seems they've had a couple new miniatures added in 10th. Added the Crusade Ancient and Execrator Chaplain onto the votes list, though it seems that it was still Hellbrecht and the Thor Brethren that placed 2nd and 3rd. They're a range that really doesn't have any models that people dislike though. The single lowest was 63% with the old artwork style Castellan. Hellbrecht's certainly a pretty excellent miniature though, and the Thor Brethren again are very nice and pretty standout for being rated this high as a squad. The top voted one though, it was the Emperor's Champion, basically the Imperium's ultimate knightly duelist. It seems that Games Workshop deliberately kept his Artificer armour really quite simple and plain, all about the practicality and overcoming his foes. The black sword chains to him, holding a bunch of prayer beads and having an iron halo, looking like he's basically calling a challenge to the enemy's champions and leaders. Overall really quite a cool miniature. Moving on from the Imperium though, and let's get on to the Chaos Marines, who have all manner of big centerpiece demons to steal people's attentions here. For the core Chaos Space Marines themselves, they had a whole bunch of different rivals, loads and loads of things ranked highly. The Master of Possession, the Nemesis Claw, the Possessed and the Venom Crawler were all rated highly. The Helldrake got a lot of love as well, it is quite an imposing flyer. For their favourite miniatures though, people were pretty even between 4 of them. Just losing out on the overall winner, there's the Demon Prince, which I think was really quite a big glow up on the previous plastic one that they had that was a bit cartoonish and a bit clunky. The current version of the Demon Prince I think is particularly nice with how flexible it is, and also having different deity-specific heads as well. There's Vashtor the Archifane, the already twisted Chaos Demigod of the Forge, really quite a creepy mix of flesh and metal there, and then the Lord Discordant on Hellstalker, a sinister robed figure riding a great big scuttling insectoid style demon engine. Seems like Chaos really quite enjoys its big fusions of flesh and machine. Taking the top spot was the main man himself though, Abaddon the Despoiler. I'm certainly not surprised to see him voted in pride of place though. I think he was voted Miniature of the Year when he came out, a centrepiece for the Forces of Chaos, all ready to break the galaxy in that Talon of Horus once again. I gotta say he's maybe got a nice enough facial sculpt compared with some Games Workshop's come out with, and he's busy stomping a Primaris Lieutenant into the dirt there as well. He's at least a relatively recent miniature as well, coming out in 8th edition. He was particularly popular when he released. For the already blighted Legion of the Death Guard, again there were a fair few strong contenders. Looks like people really enjoy the basic infantry and Terminator units here. Voted on 72%, we've got the standard Plague Marines and Typhus as well, hefty as Man Reaper aloft. And then taking second and third for the faction are the Blight Lord and Death Shroud Terminators. The Blight Lords having a whole bunch of chunky fun details, big hefty miniatures with some big mutations going on, though I still would have guessed that the Death Shroud would have beaten them with those rather iconic Man Reapers. Death Guard elites fighting with scythes are pretty well liked, and certainly well liked on the tabletop at the moment with their scary easy access to melee. For the pinnacle of the faction model-wise though, pretty much no doubt here that it's Mortarion, voted up to 89%, and he was the third Primarch to return to the 40k setting, coming not too long after Guilliman towards the start of 8th edition, with the advent of the Primaris and their fights versus Death Guard. It looks like he was almost at the very top of Warhammer 40k models in general, voted in joint second. It's just a very nicely balanced miniature and a great centrepiece, tasselled insectoid wings held aloft above him like a great Angel of Plague. It gives him really quite a nice silhouette. A massive and intimidating bone-lined scythe, a twisted and diseased Primarch staring out above his gas mask, and then a whole bunch of attendant censer bearers and hangers-on to fly with the Primarch of Nurgle into battle. I believe he was one of the best received and best selling miniatures that Games Workshop had come out with at the time. Next up for the Thousand Sons, their range again is a relatively recent one, coming out around about 2016, and the vast majority of their mainline kits were really quite well liked. For runners up for them, we've got the Scarab Occult Terminators, the set of Exalted Sorcerers, which are pretty iconic for the faction, the Infernal Master with his Conjured Screamers that came out during 9th edition, and the Rubric Marines weren't too far behind. Interestingly, it seems that the Demon Primarch of the Thousand Sons was only just bested into second place. I don't know if Magnus's slightly unusually placed horns might have been something to do with that. I feel like anecdotally maybe wasn't quite as much of a slam dunk for literally everyone as Mortarion, although obviously really well liked by loads of people. I'm sure Magnus wouldn't be too pleased that it seems that it's Ahriman who's bested him into first place. The Thousand Son Sorcerer responsible for the rubric and making his Legion all very dusty. He does feel like a pretty excellent miniature to encapsulate what you'd imagine a Thousand Son Sorcerer to be, soaring aloft on a disc of Tzeentch and conjuring up some manner of magical energies with the lightning around his left hand there. Still not really significantly ahead of the rest though, pretty well similar to Magnus and the Exalted Sorcerers. Next up for the Blood Crazed Killers of the World Eaters, it looks like two model kits seem to stick out really quite a long way for the rest. Khan the Betrayer and Lord Invocatus for two of the other named characters were voted in 3rd and 4th, though interestingly enough in 2nd place were the Khorne Berserkers themselves. I feel like they were a pretty excellent reimagination of the classic kit that they updated. Really quite a lot of cool designs for their classic helms and a bunch of different chain axes. A pretty clear winner for these guys though, and it's Angron, voted in at 85%, and again one of the more popular miniatures in 40k in general. It was released pretty recently in 9th edition along with the rest of the World Eaters range. I feel like he does a good job of living up to the unsubtle murder demon that you'd expect of him. A great enraged screaming face with a butcher's nails digging deep apparently, some pretty big chunky wings with some fairly enormous biceps there, and a pair of brutal looking though fairly finely wrought looking melee weapons. Then finally for the Deity Legions, we've got the Servants of Slaanesh in the Emperor's Children. Their range again has been a really recent one, with models coming out during 2025. And again for range updates, they feel like they were a particularly popular one as Warhammer 40k goes. Literally all of their stuff seems to be ranked highly enough. The Tormentors and Infractors maybe just being seen as a bit more run-of-the-mill as opposed to standouts. Therefore some of the ones that people enjoyed the most, Lucius the Eternal, the Lord Exultant, and the Noise Marines, all placed really quite highly. The Noise Marines coming in second, so really quite good to see people enjoying the resculpts of a kit that's waited far too long for an update. Their sonic weapons are really quite fun, and it seems that people have taken well enough to their sort of Havoc-like design with those great big amplifiers on their backpacks. Once more though, it is the Demon Primarch that takes the crown, though again not by too much, only a tiny bit ahead of the Noise Marines. It seems that for a centerpiece showcase model for the army, it's hard to beat the Great Big Wings Demons. They're still maybe a little interesting that he's not quite as highly rated as, say, Mortarion and Angron, at least within their own legions. I'm sure Fulgrim will be very displeased to be voted behind Mortarion in a looks contest. I think it was definitely really quite nicely done as a miniature, having a whole bunch of various manic and depraved looking faces, some rather lethal looking melee weapons, and that rather freaky looking pinned back skin thing that it's got going on around the icon of Slaanesh, slithering across the battlefield on that serpentine tail to do some murder. For the Chaos Knights, they've only really got two mainline kits. There's the abhorrent one, building things like the Ruinator and Desecrator, and then the War Dogs kit, of which people seem to enjoy the brutal melee-style carnivore, often being depicted as being fielded with a sort of animal mask-style face. Within all of them, though, the build for the Knight Abominant seems to outclass the rest, and by quite some margin. Kind of interesting enough, as this one's basically an upgrade sprue for the standard Chaos Knight, but it does seem that people have really quite taken to it compared with the rest. The sinister tentacle-like tendrils of the Electro Scourge, the Terror Shades nesting in the rafters, and the rather imposing tusk-like helm. I think it all works together really quite nice to cause a silhouette a bit different to the rest of the Chaos Knights out there. Overall, certainly not bad going with an upgrade sprue. Games Workshop seems to have improved the Chaos Knight kit for this one sculpt, at least compared with the rest it would seem in most people's eyes. Finally, for the Force of Chaos, we've got the Denizens of the Imperium itself. Big Wings Demon thing seems to have been the winners for the vast majority of the Chaos factions. It doesn't really feel like it's too much different there. The Chaos Demons have a whole bunch of centerpiece models. It seems that the 4 greater demons were all voted as basically the top 4 after the winner. Seems that people's favourite here were the Lord of Change, narrowly beating out the Great Unclean One, and then the Bloodthirster and Keeper of Secrets not really super far behind. I feel like all of these were pretty nicely done updates on their rather tiny looking metal models from the past. I think I would probably agree that the Lord of Change might be my favourite out of them. I just really like the way that it's done with his mix of avian features and warp fire. Standing a rank above any one deity, though, is Be'lakor the Dark Master. He is the Demon Prince of Chaos Undivided, a shadowy entity created by all 4 deities at once. And he's got a rather terrifying looking silhouette, massive great big wings, all lined with chains and skulls, a shadowy twisted warp blade with a whole bunch of smoke or fumes flickering off it, a fairly classic style demon body, with a fun base as well that he can have a primary Space Marine on. Again, certainly a model that went down really well at the time, releasing in 9th edition both for 40k and Age of Sigmar. 89% puts him on joint second with Mortarion for all the models in 40k when they're all ranked up. Moving on to the Force of Xenos though, and next up we have the Aeldari. They've had a bit of a massive faction overhaul over the last couple of editions. Loads of older sculpts updated, and it seems that in particular the Phoenix Lord sculpts are some of the most loved out of any of them. Morgan Ra, Fugan and Lycus all ranking here. Lycus being voted second, the shadowy Phoenix of the Warp Spiders, that does have a pretty awesome design for the miniature, sort of jumping out of the warp in a web style pattern. The regular Warp Spiders are up here as well, seemingly people's favourite out of the Aspect Warriors. There are lots more not all that far behind though, Barahoth and the Swooping Hawks, Azaman and also the Wraith Knight, interestingly enough. A fair bit of love for the Aeldari Super Heavy it would seem. Again though, it seems to be a win for perhaps the most obvious centerpiece model, and it's the Avatar of Cain that takes this one. The burning effigy of the bloody-handed god that again got an awesome glow up from a really old model. This one turned up mid-9th edition with the first half of the Aeldari range, and again I see a bunch of effects there with the running blood along his hand, plus the flames blending with the model, and it does have a few options as well with things like head swaps, weapon swaps and hand swaps. Overall pretty well enjoyed though, ranking in at 84%. For the Drukhari, they haven't been quite so lucky with ranged updates recently. Only a few things having updated miniatures in recent years. Seems that the highest ranked thing out of the older set of stuff is the Raider, which I think does hold up really quite well and cuts a pretty awesome silhouette. But then it does seem that the more recent kits that Games Workshop have come out with them have been pretty well liked. The Mandrakes that came out with their Kill Team sets, and Drazar the Fallen Phoenix was ranked second. It certainly seems that being a more recent miniature isn't guaranteed for success though. For example, Lilith Hesperax was ranked quite a bit lower, being one of the ones that people were a bit more mid on whether it was a better update versus the previous model. It seems that taking the crown for the Drukhari though are the Incubi themselves. Maybe a little bit unusual on lists like this to see the squad upstaging their leader, but it seems they've managed it. The models for the Drukhari Elite Guard are pretty well done, most of them fighting with the two-handed claves, the leader getting the demi-claves, and having some nice rather impressive horned demon style helms, and all ready to inflict some pain on the whims of their master I suppose. It does seem they maybe haven't had all that much competition for Drukhari releases in recent years though. There's certainly a faction that could use them more love compared with some. Perhaps on the other end of the spectrum, model support wise, we've got the Tyranids. They had their vast amount of releases for 10th edition 40k, loads of stuff coming out in the Leviathan box set, though plenty of other really cool miniatures following not so long after. Seems that all of their more popular stuff is from that more recent age of miniatures. The Lictor, Neurolictor and Death Leaper were all ranked really quite highly as the Tyranid lone operative killers. Seems that Death Leaper takes the crown there, with that rather fancy looking biocape shrouding the Tyranid assassin-in-chief. Otherwise, the new Raveners and hyper-adapted Raveners were pretty popular as well, as was the Neurotyrant from the Leviathan box. That did seem to be the single miniature that people most enjoyed at the time, being a big fancy zone throat type thing, but taken to the next level, and all looking rather eldritch horror. Placing in top for the Tyranids though, it's their big centrepiece Norn Emissary that followed them up not so very long after in the releases. It's the single biggest model that the Tyranids got in 10th edition, so nice to see it's been well liked. Feels like overall it's just pretty well balanced, a good representation of the faction overall, a big powerful Tyranid with some silent talons and a lot of raw strength, but also the spooky psychic might of the hive mind behind it as well, with those big exposed brains, both shielding it from harm and being able to blast the enemy with some psychic attacks. It's got quite a fun base as well, its tactical rock erupting in a whole bunch of Tyranid vegetation. In any case, certainly seems to be very well enjoyed by Tyranids players, voted up at 87% in the approval ratings, and that's one of the very highest in Warhammer 40k in general. For their cultist allies, the Genestealer Cults had a whole load of models that were voted in the sort of slightly upper mid kind of area, the nearest rivals for the top spot being the Jackals mounted on their motorbikes, the all rather warped muscly Aberrants, and then the Patriarch himself, the Alpha Bog, takes second. Seems fairly fitting for him as the overall faction commander and having a whole bunch of focus and having a really quite imposing silhouette. I feel like in general the Genestealer Cult miniatures are fairly well executed, though maybe just not everyone likes their aesthetic. I feel like you get people who really love them, but also people who aren't so much the biggest fans of the big-headed cultists with the mining gear kind of aesthetic that they have going on. I guess that might be the reason for the sort of middling ratings. For the single highest rated one though, that was the Genestealer Cult Kellamorph, only very slightly beating out the Patriarch it would seem at 67 versus 66. I think it kind of shows that people really quite enjoy this sculpt if it's beating out the big central focal character model for the army. But I think people both like his sort of caped cowboy sort of aesthetic, plus the sheer fun factor of the fact that he's a gunslinger with 3 guns to fire all at once, making maximal use of his 3-armed Genestealer Cult mutations there. The Leagues of Votann feel like they're in at least a fairly similar place in terms of people voting which miniatures they like. Again, really quite a recent range, most of their miniatures technically quite well executed, though perhaps quite a lot of people just rating them as kind of middling for excitement as opposed to stand out great looking. None of their kits are really rated all that low. The Chthonian Berserk seem to be the ones that people are least sold on, but again none are really rated all that high relative to 40k either. It looks like second and third we've got the Einhir Hearthguard and then the Grimnir, the Votann sort of living ancestor dwarf guy, the faction psycho with his runic staff and his hovering Corv attendants. Winning it for the leagues though, there's the Einhir Champion, the leader for the Hearthguard in his exo armour, a great big chunky weapon built into his left hand, and then either a hammer or an axe for his primary weapon, with some big thrusters to power him towards battle. Maybe not too surprised to see him winning. I feel like he's fairly well executed, with a good sense of motion and him powering towards the enemy to deal a great deal of violence out to them. As with the Hearthguard, maybe some fun stuff with a bit of inlaid dwarven finery into a futuristic spacesuit. Seems that maybe people enjoyed that sort of aspect of them from the Grimnir and the Hearthguard as well. Next up, we've got the Necrons, and they've got really quite stiff competition for strongest miniature. They had their massive range refresh back at the start of 9th edition, loads of good stuff from the Indomitus box, and they have a whole load of things that are rated around about the 70% kind of mark, to the point where it's hard to pick out too many examples to talk about. There were a few that were just notably higher than the rest though. Illumina Seraz, who preceded the Necron main release by a little way towards the end of 8th edition. The Necron Alpha Scientist doing the rather gory work of harvesting an Imperial citizen there. Really quite a fun model and quite a big, chunky and imposing one stature-wise as well. I was wondering whether or not the Silent King might win it. The Faction Commander was a pretty well-received model. A great big centrepiece on his throne with his Triarch attendants next to him. The throne itself all being very appropriate in being powered by a captured Catan. Fits in quite well with his lore there, I guess. The Minirs frame the model quite well as well, all ready to deal out a massive amount of hurt with those Annihilator beams. I feel like there's maybe a little bit of sense as the actual model of Zarek himself, maybe not being quite the sort of size and status that you might expect of a kind of god tier model in 40k as he is, so I'm not sure if that was a contributing factor here or not. Either way though, people broadly like the miniature quite a lot, and again seems to be one of the better rated ones in 40k in general. For the Necrons though, it seems that the Catan Shard of the Void Dragon was voted top, and it seems that this one with a big approval rating of 90% was the single highest rated in all of Warhammer 40k. an all rather creepy looking eldritch deity wreathed in lightning. I feel like the hover effect is pretty impressive, the sort of pixelated body that he has going on is really quite fun, and the glowing rune where a face should be really cements him as something other than thoroughly disturbing. I'm certainly not surprised to see him right on the upper end of Warhammer 40k. Maybe wouldn't have guessed that it would have beaten out certain of the Demon Primarchs though for the very top spot. I might get the impression though it might depend on the crowd that you ask, or even just a bit of randomness with if you ask the same question twice you might get different answers as to the top spot. Certainly a really well loved and awesome looking miniature though, if not exactly the easiest to transport. Next up, we've got the greenskin force of the Orks, and they're not really short on nicely executed models with a whole bunch of fun factor. Quite a few of them having had some new releases with the Beast Snagger Wave and a few other updates in recent times. For runners up for them, the rather mad Big Mech with his exo legs and shock booster came in at 68%. The Tank Busters and Breaker Boys around the same sort of level. And Mozrog Scragbad and the Beast Boss on Squigosaur voted slightly higher. I feel like they're a particularly fun one with a great big orky war boss riding atop a squig that's halfway between a shark and dinosaur. In second place though, and winning against the rest of those, are the Commandos, again pretty notably high for a squad here at 75%. They came out alongside the Death Corps Krieg for the launch of Kill Team and have a whole bunch of cool details. The Bomb Squig and the Ninja Goss are quite fun, plus they have a whole bunch of specialist options, and a bunch of them have a lot of character with their different headpieces and things. No surprise to see them well rated. Again for the Orks though, it was like there was always going to be one winner, and that's Ghazghkull Thraka. The Prophet of the War himself is a pretty awesome centerpiece model, with huge chunky and threatening mega armor, a massive claw that looks like it's made to deal a whole load of damage, and a great big shooter that's I'm sure going to be very inaccurately deployed, but firing so many slugs at the enemies that something's going to hit. Makari's trusty Banner Waver adds a bit of fun factor as well, and perhaps helps out on the defensive front a surprising amount, being suspiciously lucky in game. Overall doesn't seem like there's any big debate as to him winning for the Orks, and again is one of the very highest rated models in 40k in general it seems. Finally, we've got the Forces of the Greater Good with the Tau Empire, and while they have a fair few kits that were well received, Shadowton the Crutox Rampagers and the Battlesuit Commander, all of the choices from 1st through to 4th were all battlesuits of one shape or another. We've got the big central damage deal that is the Riptide on 69, the Broadside on 70, and the Ghostkill Big Stealth Suit up on 73. Kind of interesting to see these ones voted a fair bit higher than the Crisis Suit. I probably would have rated them on a similar sort of level to these ones myself. For the winning model for the Tau though, it's Commander Farsight. Again, centerpiece fighty character, taking the limelight from the more line kits. I must say the Farsight's model was done particularly well. A bunch of Japanese samurai sort of vibes. Your very natural base with the Blossom Tree on it I thought was particularly fun. A melee battlesuit commander with the Dawn Blade was always going to have a rule of cool, and probably doesn't hurt that he's got a good story to go alongside. I feel like a lot of people want to root for him versus the more mainline forces of the Tau Empire. Again, voted pretty high here, with approval ratings of 85. With the Xenos factions talked about though, that just about brings us to the end of the main list. Here just for a bit of a summary are some of the very highest rated ones in Warhammer 40k. As mentioned, it does feel like one thing that the community agrees on is that some form of great big winged demon deity is likely to go down well in Warhammer 40k. The Void Dragon, then Mortarion and Be'lakor making up the top spots there. And if not, I feel like a lot of the rest are made up of either Terminators or fighty centerpiece character models. I guess by their nature and often just being ones-off centerpiece models are kind of likely to rank a bit higher than most here, maybe feeling a bit more special. I guess the squads that break through are particularly impressive as a result, the Inner Circle Companions, Deathwing Knights and the Deathshroud Terminators making it up to the 80% plus, though otherwise beyond them there aren't too many ones that you could field more than one of in an army. Let me know your thoughts though. Would you agree with the models that have been voted highest on the list or not? Look forward to hearing your takes down in the comments. I'll leave this one there for now though. As mentioned, a big thank you to Baron of Dice for sponsoring the video. As mentioned, they're a high quality dice maker based in the USA. They've got a whole bunch of dice designs that could be relevant enough for a whole load of 40k factions. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their stuff. They've got the Auspex code for 5% off if you do buy anything through them. In any case though, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you've been enjoying and you'd like to support the videos on the channel, Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description, so a big thank you to anyone choosing to support there. In any case though, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.